My name is Eleanor Hayes, 61 years old, once a professor of history at Ashby Women's Academy. People say the century is about to turn. Pocket cameras are now sold in Tremont Street shops. Telegrams move faster than whispers. But one truth remains as old as scripture. Betrayal always finds its way to a wedding. That afternoon, Boston lay under a thin veil of mist. The bells of Park Street Church chimed softly while I sat by the window of my red-brick townhouse, staring at a gold-stamped invitation. The marriage of Arthur Hayes and Clara Whitmore, Cape Cod, Seaside Chapel. I had practiced my polite smile, the kind a mother must wear. Arthur, my only son, raised on patched sleeves and endless patience, was marrying the so-called Rose of the Whitmore family. And of course, Jonathan Hayes, my ex-husband, would be there, dashing as ever, hair slicked, bow tie neat like an arrogant exclamation point. Once upon a time, at 20, I believed those laughing eyes were a promise. Years later, I learned they were nothing more than a curtain hiding a darkened room. On my desk beside the invitation rested a new pocket camera, a gift from a former student, something I meant to use only for fog along the Charles River or autumn maples. Little did I know fate had already placed this prop in my hands for the drama about to unfold. That evening I attended the Whitmore family's pre-wedding gathering. Gaslight glowed warm across velvet drapes as Clara entered in ivory lace, pearls at her wrist, her smile carefully rehearsed. When she dipped her head in greeting, I caught Jonathan's eyes sliding toward her, sharp, deliberate, and Clara did not look away. Sparks flared between them, subtle but undeniable, and my old bones went cold. "Tomorrow in Cape Cod," Jonathan murmured in his velvet voice, "we will have a perfect wedding." I returned his words with the polite smile of a retired professor, though my heart beat with warning. That night I packed my travel trunk. The pocket camera lay on top. Outside, church bells faded into the mist. Tomorrow I would ride to Cape Cod, ready to play the dutiful mother of the groom. And if history had taught me anything, it was this: the truth always surfaces at the very hour people most wish to bury it. The next morning, the Whitmore townhouse buzzed with the rustle of silk gowns and the clatter of carriage wheels. Servants carried trunks down the marble steps, while Clara's bridesmaids giggled about seashell bouquets and seaside photographs. To any passerby, it looked like the perfect society wedding preparing to unfold. To me, it looked like a play, lavish costumes, rehearsed lines, but cracks already showing in the scenery. On the train to Cape Cod, Arthur sat beside Clara, holding her hand with the devotion only a young groom could muster. He spoke of their future, his plans to open a law practice in Boston, the townhouse he hoped to buy near Beacon Hill. Clara nodded sweetly, but her eyes drifted often toward the end of the carriage, where Jonathan reclined with a newspaper. Each time he turned a page, I noticed her lips curve in the faintest smile, as though the sound itself was their private signal. I forced myself to look away, clutching the pocket camera in my lap. Was I imagining it? A mother's jealousy, perhaps, or an old woman's suspicion of youth. But history has taught me, what seems like chance is often pattern. When the train reached Hyannis, the sea air hit us, brisk, salted, sharp as truth. The resort had spared no expense, gas lamps lining the pier, carriages waiting, champagne chilled in silver buckets. The Whitmores stepped down like royalty, while Jonathan offered his arm to Clara as if he were escorting a queen. Arthur, carrying luggage, looked like a servant in his own wedding procession. My jaw tightened. At supper that evening, Jonathan raised a toast, his voice rich and practiced. To Clara and Arthur, may their love outshine the century to come. Glasses clinked, guests applauded. Yet under the table I noticed Clara's satin slipper brush against Jonathan's polished shoe, a movement so quick most would have missed it. He did not flinch. My heart pounded in my chest. I told myself it was nerves or wine or imagination. Still, when Clara leaned too close to Jonathan's ear and whispered something that made him smirk, I knew tomorrow's vows were already compromised. That night, while others retired to their seaside rooms, I stood on the balcony, waves crashing against the rocks below. In my hands, the pocket camera gleamed under the moonlight. For the first time, I felt its weight not as novelty, but as weapon. Sleep would not come. The resort's grand clock struck past midnight, its chimes echoing through the marble halls like a warning bell. My room overlooked the moonlit shoreline, waves breaking against the rocks in a rhythm that should have been soothing. Yet my mind spun with images: Clara's sly glances, Jonathan's knowing smirk, Arthur's blind devotion. At last, I rose, slipped a shawl over my shoulders, and stepped into the corridor. Gas lamps flickered low, casting long shadows across the patterned carpet. The hush of the hour was thick, broken only by the occasional creak of wooden beams adjusting to the salt air. I meant only to breathe, perhaps walk to the veranda and clear my head. But as I passed the west wing, a sound froze me in place. A woman's voice, soft, breathless, almost laughing, escaped from behind a half-closed door. My heart stuttered. The brass plaque read Suite 12, Jonathan Hayes. I told myself to move on. Whatever Jonathan did in his solitude was no longer my burden. But then I heard another sound, his unmistakable baritone, low and intimate. And then silence, the heavy kind, followed by the rustle of fabric and a muffled sigh. My pulse thundered. I moved closer, pressing myself against the cool plaster wall. Through the narrow slit of the door, a shadow shifted, and for an instant I saw the curve of Clara's arm, bare against Jonathan's chest. His silver hair bent toward her, their faces too close to be mistaken for innocence. The corridor tilted around me. The daughter-in-law I had tried to welcome, the father my son still idolized, together on the eve of vows meant to bind families. The door opened suddenly. Clara stepped out, cheeks flushed, hair tousled beneath her lace robe. She glanced both ways, not seeing me tucked behind the drapery of a decorative alcove. Jonathan followed, shirt unbuttoned, his expression smug as ever. "Tomorrow it all changes," Clara whispered. Jonathan's hand brushed her cheek. "Then let tonight be ours." I felt bile rise in my throat. With shaking fingers, I reached into my shawl, pulled out the pocket camera, and snapped one flash, one truth, one weapon. Neither of them noticed. They parted, slipping into separate rooms, leaving the hallway empty but for me, and the undeniable proof clenched in my hands. I don't remember walking back to my room. My legs carried me as if by instinct, my shawl slipping off one shoulder, the camera clutched tight to my chest like a relic. The image was still seared into my mind. Clara's flushed face, Jonathan's hand against her cheek. By the time I reached my door, I knew what I had to do. I could not let Arthur walk blind into a marriage bound with deceit. I knocked on his door once, twice, 3 times until he answered, eyes half-lidded with sleep. He wore only his shirt sleeves, hair mussed. "Mother." His voice was groggy, then sharper at the sight of my trembling frame. "What's wrong?" I pushed past him into the room. The candle on his desk threw nervous shadows across the walls. "Sit," I said, my voice unsteady. He obeyed, confused, watching me pace. "It's Clara," I whispered, "and Jonathan." At once the fog of sleep vanished from his eyes. "What about them?" I opened the camera, pulled out the glass plate, still warm from the flash. My hands shook as I slid it across the desk. The faint, ghostly outline of Clara and Jonathan in each other's arms stared back at us. The grain was blurred, imperfect, but unmistakable. Arthur froze. For a long moment, he did not breathe. Then, slowly, he reached out and touched the image as though hoping the figures would dissolve beneath his fingertips. "No," he whispered. He wouldn't. "I'm sorry, son," I said softly. "I saw it with my own eyes the night before your wedding." His face drained of color. He sank back in the chair, hands gripping the armrest so tightly his knuckles whitened. I expected rage. I expected despair. What came instead chilled me more. Calm. He rose, crossed to the window, and stared out at the black sea beyond. "You will say nothing," he said quietly. I blinked. "Arthur, you will tell no one, not tonight, not tomorrow, do you understand?" My voice cracked. "But the vows, the humiliation." I said. He turned, eyes hard as steel I had never seen in him before. "Leave it to me." The candle flickered between us, casting his face half in shadow. My son, my sweet, trusting Arthur, now looked like a man who had just chosen his battlefield. And I realized with a shiver he wasn't broken. He was preparing for war. Morning broke bright and cruel. Sunlight spilled across the sea as if the world itself were mocking the storm that churned beneath my ribs. I dressed carefully, a navy silk gown, gloves buttoned to the wrist, the appearance of serenity stitched into every seam. Inside, I was trembling. The hotel dining hall brimmed with chatter. Bridesmaids in pale rose sat and laughed over buttered rolls. The Whitmores clinked silver spoons against porcelain teacups as though nothing in their world could crack. Then Clara swept in, radiant in a cream morning dress, her hair pinned with pearls. She greeted me with a sugary smile. "Good morning, future Mother Hayes," she chirped, sliding gracefully into her chair. "Did you sleep well?" Her composure was flawless. Not a trace of guilt lingered in her eyes. I swallowed hard, the taste of iron at the back of my throat. "As well as one can," I murmured. Arthur entered moments later. He looked freshly pressed, calm to the point of eeriness. He bent and kissed Clara's cheek, whispering something that made her giggle. If I hadn't seen the photograph myself, I might have believed everything was perfect. But then, just for an instant, he glanced my way. His eyes, flat and calculating, told me he hadn't forgotten. He was biding his time. And then Jonathan arrived. Late, of course, savoring the attention. His suit was immaculate, his silver hair combed back, his swagger intact. He made the rounds like a visiting monarch, stopping at Clara's chair. With a gallant bow, he lifted her hand and pressed a kiss upon it. "Sleep well, my dear." His voice was velvet dipped in poison. "Like a baby," she replied smoothly, her lashes lowered. The room erupted in laughter at some trivial toast, but my stomach clenched. Around me, guests beamed, blissfully unaware of the charade. As plates were cleared and carriages prepared to take us to the seaside chapel, I felt the edges of my composure fray. Arthur remained perfectly polite, Clara perfectly charming, Jonathan perfectly smug. It was a stage play, every role rehearsed. Yet under that polished surface, I sensed the ticking of a hidden clock. My son had not broken down. He had not run. He was waiting. And when the moment came, I knew the truth would not stay buried. By late afternoon, the seaside chapel stood gleaming against the horizon. Its whitewashed timbers and tall, arched windows framed the restless Atlantic beyond. Rows of wooden chairs had been arranged neatly on the sand, draped with garlands of roses and ivy. Musicians tuned their violins beneath a striped tent, their notes floating like fragile promises above the surf. Guests arrived in a flurry of parasols and polished boots, voices rising with excitement. To them, this was the event of the season. The Whitmore heiress marrying the Hayes heir, a union of prestige and fortune. They spoke of gowns and estates, not betrayal and ruin. Only I knew the ground beneath us was already cracked. I took my seat in the front row, hands folded in my lap, knuckles white beneath my gloves. Across the aisle, Jonathan sat with the bride's family, his posture impeccable, his expression smug. He nodded to me as though we were cordial ex-spouses at a garden party. My stomach twisted. Then the procession began. The bridesmaids glided down the aisle in dusty rose gowns, followed by the groomsmen, each step measured and serene. At last came Arthur. My son walked alone, shoulders squared, midnight blue suit catching the last light of day. His gaze did not falter, his expression unreadable. Yet when our eyes met, he offered me the smallest nod, a signal, perhaps, that he was ready. And then the air shifted. The organ swelled, and Clara appeared at the top of the aisle. She was breathtaking, draped in ivory silk and lace, her veil trailing like spun clouds. Her smile was radiant, her eyes locked on Arthur with a devotion so convincing even I felt the sting of doubt. Could a woman look like that and harbor such treachery? Jonathan, ever the gallant, escorted her down the aisle, whispering something into her ear that made her lips curve. At the altar, he placed her hand into Arthur's, a symbolic gesture that felt more like a curse. The officiant, a college friend of Arthur's, hastily ordained, lifted his voice. "We are gathered here today to witness the union of Arthur Hayes and Clara Whitmore in holy matrimony." His words blurred beneath the pounding in my ears. My breath caught, my pulse quickened. I clutched the hem of my gown, praying, fearing, waiting. Because I knew, when the question came, when those sacred vows were spoken, Arthur would not play the fool. The storm was coming, and this chapel was about to become its stage. The organ faded into stillness, replaced by the steady rhythm of waves slapping the shore. Guests leaned forward in their chairs, fans fluttering, whispers stilled. The officiant's voice carried clear over the ocean air. "Arthur Hayes, do you take Clara Whitmore to be your lawful wife? To honor, cherish, and keep her, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, until death do you part?" Time itself seemed to hold its breath. Clara gazed up at Arthur, her cheeks flushed beneath the veil, her lips curved in a trembling smile of expectation. Jonathan straightened in his seat, pride etched across his handsome, aging face, and my heart pounded like a war drum in my chest, terrified of what my son would say, terrified of what he might not. Arthur let the silence linger. He studied Clara for a long, unnerving moment, his eyes cool, searching. Then, with a voice steady as iron, he answered, "No, I do not." The words cracked through the chapel like a pistol shot. Guests gasped, chairs scraped against the sand, and somewhere in the back a woman dropped her parasol. Even the ocean seemed to fall silent. Clara's smile froze, her lips parted, trembling. "Arthur, darling, this isn't funny." Arthur didn't blink. "You're right, it isn't funny. Not when a bride spends the night before her wedding in her father-in-law's bed." The air exploded. Shouts, gasps, the scrape of boots as half the congregation rose to their feet. Clara staggered back, color draining from her face. Jonathan surged up, his chair toppling behind him. "That's a vile lie," he thundered, his voice shaking the rafters. Arthur reached into his breast pocket with calm precision. He withdrew the fragile glass plate from my camera, mounted now in a small frame. He held it high for all to see. Even blurred, the image told the truth. Clara, disheveled and flushed, Jonathan's silver head bent close. "This," Arthur said, his voice cutting clean as a blade, "is no lie." The crowd erupted again, scandalized murmurs rising like surf against rocks. Clara's bouquet slipped from her hands, roses scattering across the sand like drops of blood. And for the first time that day, Jonathan Hayes had no words. Chaos surged through the seaside chapel like a storm tide. Guests craned their necks, whispers colliding into shouts, parasols snapping shut as society matrons gasped behind gloved hands. The Whitmores sat frozen, faces pale as parchment, their carefully polished reputation unraveling before the entire congregation. Jonathan, ever the performer, attempted to reclaim the stage. He strode toward the altar, his voice booming with outrage. "This is slander, a grotesque fabrication meant to humiliate me. My own son has been poisoned by his mother's bitterness." But Arthur didn't flinch. He placed the framed photograph on the altar table where everyone could see it. "Poisoned? No, father, enlightened. At last." Clara stumbled forward, her veil slipping, her eyes wet with frantic tears. "Arthur, please listen to me. I was distraught, nervous about the wedding. He only comforted me, nothing more." Her voice broke as she grasped Arthur's sleeve with trembling fingers. Arthur's expression didn't change. "Comfort." He pulled his arm free. "Do all your comforts end in a disheveled robe and lips swollen from his kiss?" Gasps rippled through the crowd like a wave. Someone muttered, "Shameful," while another hissed, "The Whitmores will never recover." Clara's composure cracked. She dropped to her knees in the sand, silk pooling around her like the wreckage of a ship. "I love you, Arthur," she sobbed, mascara running. "It meant nothing, I swear it. Don't throw everything away." Jonathan, livid, slammed his hand against the altar rail. "Enough, you will not destroy my name with this circus. I'll see you ruined in court, boy." He didn't finish. Arthur moved with startling swiftness, his fist catching Jonathan square across the jaw. The crowd shrieked as Jonathan collapsed into the sand, stunned and gasping. Arthur stood tall above him, adjusting his cuff as if nothing had happened. "Ruined," he said coldly. "No, father, you've managed that all by yourself." The guests erupted again, half in horror, half in awe. Phones of the era did not yet exist to immortalize the scandal, but word of mouth would travel faster than telegram. By sundown, Boston would know every sordid detail. Clara remained crumpled, Jonathan sprawled, and Arthur, my son, stood unshaken at the altar, a man who had chosen truth over pretense. And I, in my front row seat, realized with a shiver that the real wedding had never been between Arthur and Clara. It was between truth and deception, and truth had just spoken its vows. For a moment, time itself fractured. The chapel was no longer a sanctuary but a courtroom, the surf outside pounding like a judge's gavel. Guests scrambled to their feet, some shielding their faces with fans, others leaning forward, hungry for every sordid detail. Clara staggered upright, her gown heavy with sand, her veil torn. "Arthur, I beg you don't humiliate me further. We can talk, we can." Arthur raised a hand, silencing her. His voice rang out steady and merciless. "The humiliation is yours, Clara, not mine. You chose it when you entered my father's room. You sealed it when you signed the marriage contract last week." Murmurs rippled like wildfire. Contract. Every head turned. Arthur's lips curved in a grim smile. "Yes, by law we are already bound, and by the terms of the Whitmore Hayes prenuptial, any act of infidelity strips you of all claim, money, property, name. You arrive at this altar penniless." Clara's face crumpled as if he'd struck her. She tried to speak, but her throat closed on the words. Jonathan, still reeling from Arthur's blow, struggled to rise. His jaw was reddened, his pride bruised beyond repair. "You insolent," he growled, but his voice broke under the weight of whispers around him. "Disgrace, predator, betrayal." Arthur turned to the congregation, his midnight suit dusted with sand but his dignity intact. "Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for your attendance. Today's ceremony is concluded. Please enjoy the reception. There is wine enough for everyone. As for the bride and the father of the groom," his gaze sliced toward Clara and Jonathan, "they may explain themselves to Boston society come morning." A stunned silence followed, then a sudden, awkward burst of movement. Guests rose, some rushing for carriages, others gathering in tight circles to trade gasps and speculation. The Whitmores huddled together, pale and ruined, their legacy shattered in a single afternoon. Clara collapsed once more into her bridesmaid's arms, her sobs carrying over the waves. Jonathan stood off to the side, spitting sand, his once immaculate cravat hanging loose like a noose. And Arthur, he remained at the altar, calm and unbending, as if he had planned this theater all along. I watched him from the front row, my heart torn between pride and dread. For my son had won, but victory bought with such ruthless precision might carve scars deeper than defeat. By nightfall, the chapel stood deserted, its roses wilted, silk ribbons torn loose by the sea breeze. But in Hyannis proper, the scandal had already taken on a life of its own. In the hotel dining hall, matrons whispered behind teacups, young men scribbled hurried notes for the society pages, and the Whitmores locked themselves in their suite, curtains drawn against the world. Arthur, however, was strangely composed. He sat on the balcony of our adjoining rooms, coat discarded, collar loosened, a glass of whiskey in his hand. The moonlight burnished his features, sharp and unfamiliar, no longer the boy I raised, but a man forged in betrayal. I joined him quietly, folding my shawl tighter around my shoulders. For a moment, we listened only to the surf, the relentless crash of waves cleansing the shore of footprints and wreckage. At last I spoke. "Arthur, what happens now?" He swirled the amber liquid in his glass, watching it catch the light. "Now, the law takes its course. Clara signed her ruin with her own hand. Jonathan," his jaw tightened, "will spend the rest of his days living beneath the shadow of what he did. As for me, I am free." I frowned. "Free, my dear, you looked calm today, but you cannot tell me it did not cost you." Arthur turned his gaze on me then, and I saw it, the cold clarity of a strategist. "It cost me my illusions, that's all. Do you know, Mother, when you showed me that plate last night, I didn't feel grief, not even rage, just confirmation. A whisper I'd ignored for years, suddenly proven true." He leaned back, exhaling slowly. "I spent the rest of that night in consultation with Mr. Alden, our solicitor. Yes, I called him at 3 in the morning. It was expensive, but he reminded me of the prenup's clause. Infidelity, even during engagement, strips every claim. That was all I needed." I gripped the railing, staring at him. "So you chose the altar as your battlefield." Arthur's lips curved, not in humor, but in grim satisfaction. "They humiliated you for years. Father paraded his affairs, Clara mocked you to your face. I wanted them both to taste that same shame, not in whispers, but in front of every witness they'd hoped to impress." The wind shifted, carrying the scent of salt and lantern smoke. I studied my son, equal parts proud and unsettled. He had defended himself, defended truth, but in the process, he had learned to wield cruelty like a sword. Down below, the sea swallowed another wave of broken roses. And I wondered, when a man learns victory this way, does he ever unlearn it? Winter settled hard over Boston when the legal battle began. Snow laced the city's rooftops like powdered marble, and the courthouse loomed cold and austere against the gray sky. Inside, however, the air pulsed with heat. Spectators, reporters, and society gossips crowded the benches, eager to witness the ruin of a once-esteemed family. Clara sat at the plaintiff's table, pale beneath her feathered hat, clutching a lace handkerchief as if it could shield her from the avalanche descending. Her lawyers had prepared a dozen excuses, claims of coercion, of misunderstanding, even of a harmless emotional indiscretion. Yet when Arthur's solicitor rose, carrying the fragile glass plate photograph encased in protective frame, the room drew breath as one. "Exhibit A," he announced, placing it before the judge. The image, grainy, imperfect, yet unmistakable, spoke louder than any testimony. Clara's downcast eyes, Jonathan's hand on her face, proof captured in light and shadow. The judge's gavel struck. "The prenuptial contract is clear. Infidelity voids all claim to the Hayes estate. Mrs. Whitmore Hayes, you leave this union with nothing." Clara collapsed against her counsel, her sobs muffled by the thunder of whispers. The Whitmores, seated behind her, looked as though they'd aged 20 years in a single ruling. And Jonathan, once the peacock of Boston society, sat alone in the back row, his face drawn and gray. He had refused to testify, too proud to admit his role, too cornered to deny it. The murmurs around him, disgrace, predator, unfit father, cut deeper than any verdict. Arthur stood when the judgment was read, straight-backed, expression calm. "Your Honor," he said, his voice clear. "I ask that proceedings be swift for the sake of all present." The gavel fell again. It was done. Outside, the press swarmed. Headlines screamed across the next morning's papers. "Whitmore heiress disgraced Hayes heir vindicated." Clara's name became shorthand for ruin, Jonathan's for scandal. That evening, Arthur returned home to my townhouse, snow melting from his coat. He set the court papers on my table and met my eyes with a steadiness that unnerved me. "It's finished," he said simply. "She has nothing, he has less, and we—" He paused, as though weighing the cost of the word. "We are free. But freedom, I thought as I watched the snow bury the city in silence, does not always come without shadows." Spring thawed the city, but for Clara Whitmore, there was no season of renewal. Word of her disgrace spread faster than blossoms on the common. Invitations that once arrived daily in gilt envelopes ceased altogether. The Whitmores shuttered their Beacon Hill mansion, creditors circling like vultures. Clara herself was seen only rarely, veiled in black, slipping into her parents' crumbling townhouse, a ghost of the woman who had once rehearsed smiles for society's admiration. Jonathan fared no better. Once he had held court in the best parlors, glass of port in hand, charming widows and debutantes alike. Now doors closed before he could knock. His law firm dissolved his partnership to preserve integrity, and even his oldest companions avoided his gaze at the gentlemen's club. When we crossed paths on Tremont Street one raw March morning, he lifted his hat in hollow courtesy. But the swagger was gone. His once silver crown seemed dulled, his shoulders stooped. He looked like a statue that had weathered one storm too many. Arthur, meanwhile, set himself to rebuilding, not from ruin, but from revelation. He poured his energy into his law studies, graduating with honors and accepting a position at a firm that valued his composure under fire. He moved into a modest townhouse near the river, preferring solitude and work over the shallow rituals of drawing-room society. The gossip pages dubbed him the man who refused a bride at the altar, but rather than shrink from the title, he wore it with quiet pride. At home, over supper, he spoke little of Clara or Jonathan. Instead, he asked me about my lectures, about books, about history itself, as if turning to the past for guidance on how to shape his future. I saw in him both the boy I raised and a sharper, sterner man forged in betrayal's furnace. And I found myself walking lighter, as though some invisible weight had lifted. For 20 years I had borne the humiliation of Jonathan's affairs, the sting of my son's misplaced loyalty. Now, in the echo of scandal, I discovered something unexpected. Not just justice, but release. Yet even in that release, I wondered, could one truly build a future free of shadows when betrayal had written itself so deeply into our family's history? By the turn of the century, Boston society had shifted its gaze from Clara Whitmore's disgrace to newer scandals, railroad fortunes collapsing, a governor's son caught in some gambling den. Yet when Arthur entered a ballroom, whispers still followed. Not ridicule, but curiosity. He was the man who had stood at the altar and said no. The man who had humiliated a Whitmore and felled his own father in one breath. Young women, urged by their mothers, fluttered around him like moths to lamplight. Proposals disguised as friendly teas filled his post each week. Some saw a challenge, to be the woman who could tame him. Others, more practical, saw a wealthy, well-connected bachelor whose scandal had only sharpened his reputation. Arthur accepted their invitations politely but rarely twice. He would bow, converse, even dance, but his smile never softened, his eyes never lingered. "I will not build a life on pretense," he told me one evening as we walked along the Charles, gas lamps glowing against the dark water. "Not again. Better solitude than a gilded lie." His words carried no bitterness, only clarity. I realized then he was not merely avoiding matrimony. He was shaping a life apart from society's shallow stage. He joined reform circles, arguing for fair labor laws. He volunteered his legal skills to defend immigrants cheated by landlords. Slowly, Boston began to speak of him not as the betrayed groom but as the principled barrister. Jonathan, still skulking in shadows, tried once to send Arthur a letter, flowery words about reconciliation, father and son united against gossip. Arthur handed it to me, unopened. "The past belongs to him," he said quietly. "My future does not." I studied my son that night, the lamplight catching the hard line of his jaw. He had inherited Jonathan's charm but stripped it of deceit, replacing it with resolve. The Whitmores had sought a pawn. Jonathan had sought a reflection. Neither realized what they had truly made, a man who would not bend to anyone's script. And in that realization, I felt a cautious hope. Perhaps our family's story was no longer one of betrayal, but of transformation. 2 years after that infamous altar, the Hayes name had taken on an unexpected new hue. Where once it had been whispered with scandal, it was now spoken with a cautious respect. In the courts, Arthur was earning a reputation as the man who would not be bought, turning away bribes, refusing to twist the law for the city's wealthy barons. The same newspapers that had printed Clara's humiliation now praised Hayes, the barrister who defends the voiceless. At first, I feared society's forgiveness would be fleeting, that every dance, every dinner party would resurrect Clara's sobs or Jonathan's collapse. But Boston's memory proved fickle, and people admire strength more than scandal. By the spring of 1902, my son's name carried a weight no fortune alone could buy. Integrity. Jonathan, meanwhile, had faded into near obscurity. He was spotted once in New York, dining with strangers who did not know his history. Another time in Philadelphia, rumored to be chasing yet another doomed scheme. Each sighting reached me like a faint echo of a man already half buried. He no longer defined Arthur's story. Clara had vanished into Europe with her mother, the Whitmore estate sold to pay creditors. Occasionally, a rumor reached Boston, Clara in Paris, draped in black, Clara in Rome, living off borrowed coin. But she was a ghost, a reminder of a choice made and lost. And me, I found myself strangely lighter. I attended lectures again, even published a small treatise on colonial histories. In the parlor, students came to seek advice, and for the first time in decades, I was not defined as Jonathan's wife or the bitter ex-wife. I was Eleanor Hayes in my own right. One evening, Arthur and I stood together on the common, watching the gas lamps glow against the spring fog. "Our name was broken," he said softly, "but now it stands for something again." I slipped my hand through his arm. Not because of wealth, not because of scandal, because of how you carried it when the world was watching. He was quiet for a long time, then smiled, a true smile, free of bitterness. And in that moment, I knew the Hayes legacy was no longer a chain of betrayals. It was becoming a story of resilience. The years have a way of softening sharp edges, though they never erase them entirely. By 1910, the city had changed. Electric streetcars rattled down Tremont, women in wide hats spoke openly of suffrage, and the old brick row houses were slowly giving way to modern apartments. Yet in the quiet of my townhouse parlor, some truths remained unshaken. Arthur had grown into a man of stature, though not the kind his father once sought. He was not the richest, nor the most fashionable, but when he entered a courtroom, silence followed. His name had become a promise, that justice would be argued without fear and without compromise. Mothers whispered of him to their daughters still, but Arthur chose his solitude carefully, never rushing to wed again. "Better to live honestly alone," he often said, "than falsely bound." Jonathan never returned. Word reached us that he died abroad in a modest boarding house in Lisbon, his fortune gone, his charm long spent. The notice was short, buried in the papers. No funeral here, no mourners, only a name fading into footnotes. Clara, too, remained a shadow, rumors of a second marriage in Italy, whispers of debts unpaid. I no longer felt anger when her name arose, only pity. Betrayal had been her weapon, but also her undoing. And me, I sit now by the window where I once clutched a gilt-edged invitation, terrified of the storm ahead. The world beyond is quieter, and so am I. I raised a son who saw truth for what it was, and who refused to bend beneath lies, even when love tempted him blind. That is a legacy stronger than estates or titles. Sometimes, when I pass the old camera on my shelf, I think of that night in Cape Cod, the flash, the proof, the tremor in my hands. It was not just a photograph. It was the moment I chose to trust my own eyes, my own voice. History, I told my students once, is not made by the powerful alone. It is written by those who, when tested, refuse to look away. And in the end, perhaps that is my story, too.